He thought his power would protect him. He believed that no one would dare challenge him, not with the years of respect, influence, and control he had carefully built up over his decades-long career. But what he didn't realize was that when Pam Bondi exposed his secret deals in court, his world would shatter in an instant. Pam Bondi, Florida's former attorney general, was no stranger to high-stakes battles. She had faced corrupt politicians, dangerous criminals, and powerful organizations that thought they were untouchable. But this one was different. As she sat in her office, flipping through a thick stack of files, Pam knew she had something massive on her hands. Every page she read told a story of deception, manipulation, and outright corruption. But the most shocking part of all, a respected judge, someone who had sworn to uphold the law, was at the center of it all. Judge Robert Kinsey, who had presided over countless cases for over 2 decades, had somehow turned the system into his own personal empire. His reputation was pristine on paper, but Bondi knew better than to trust appearances. Across from her, Kyle Donahue, her whistleblower, a former courthouse clerk, sat nervously, his hands shaking. "You're telling me Kinsey fixed cases for years, and no one noticed?" Pam asked, disbelief lining her voice. Kyle sighed, nodding. "People noticed, but they looked the other way. He was careful, never took cash directly. But I saw it, case files disappearing, verdicts that made no sense, rulings that favored the same people over and over again." Bondi's gut told her that this wasn't just the corruption of one man. It was a system designed to protect the guilty and silence anyone who got too close to the truth. She wasn't going to let that happen. She was ready to take on the fight, even if it meant challenging an entire network that had allowed Kinsey's reign to continue unchecked. But she knew one thing for certain. If they were right, Kinsey wouldn't go down quietly. As Pam Bondi sat in her car outside the Hillsborough County Courthouse, the oppressive Florida heat pressing against the windows, her thoughts were focused on what was about to unfold. Inside, Judge Robert Kinsey was carrying on like any other day, his black robe shielding him from suspicion. But Bondi wasn't going to let this continue. She had already seen the cracks in the system, and now it was time to expose them. Her phone buzzed. Detective Mark Henshaw's name appeared on the screen, and Bondi answered immediately, her voice steady but sharp. "Tell me you found something." "I found it," Henshaw replied, his tone low. "Kinsey's got assets hidden under dummy corporations. We traced 3 separate shell companies back to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They all link back to cases he ruled on." Pam tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her mind racing. "This is enough to open an investigation, right?" Henshaw hesitated before speaking again. "It's more than that. He's moving money. He's trying to cover his tracks. He knows he's being watched." Bondi's pulse quickened. "If he's planning to run, we don't have much time." She hung up, the reality of the situation hitting her hard. This wasn't just about taking down a corrupt judge. This was about exposing the system that had been protecting him all along. Pam had no intention of letting Kinsey escape the consequences of his actions. Inside the courthouse, she had her chance. As the trial for a corporate fraud case unfolded in front of her, Pam's eyes remained fixed on Judge Kinsey, watching his every move, knowing the truth she was about to bring to light would tear his carefully constructed world apart. As the trial recessed, she made her move. Pam Bondi walked into the courtroom, her heels clicking on the marble floor, a file clutched in her hand. Kinsey, sitting high on his bench, exuded the same calm authority that had allowed him to manipulate the system for years. But Pam was here to end that. The truth had come too far for him to hide now. "Your Honor," she called, interrupting the proceedings. Kinsey looked up, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Miss Bondi, you are not counsel in this matter. Sit down." But Bondi wasn't there to obey his commands. She placed the thick file on the clerk's desk, its contents more powerful than any ruling Kinsey could ever make. The entire courtroom fell silent as Pam spoke. "Robert Kinsey," she began, her voice cutting through the tension, You have violated the trust of this court, the people of Florida, and the very foundation of justice itself." Kinsey's face paled. He tried to dismiss it, to hold on to the power he had spent years building. "This is a baseless attack," he spat. But before he could say more, the doors of the courtroom swung open and Detective Henshaw, flanked by federal agents, entered the room. The atmosphere shifted. Kinsey's world was crashing down. Pam stepped forward. "This drive contains records of offshore accounts, illegal transactions, and case tampering spanning the last decade. Every ruling you made that was bought and paid for." Kinsey's grip on his gavel tightened, but he was no longer in control. The agent stepped forward, and in a flash, Kinsey was handcuffed. The weight of his power, the years of manipulation, crumbled with each click of the cuffs. As Kinsey was escorted out of the courtroom, Pam Bondi stood tall, unwavering. The courtroom that had once been a stage for his reign of injustice was now a place of reckoning. Kinsey's attempt to intimidate her, his threats, were nothing but whispers in the wind now. His fear was palpable. And in that moment, Pam knew. This was only the beginning. The fight for justice was just getting started. The courtroom was still buzzing with disbelief as Judge Robert Kinsey was led away in handcuffs, his fate sealed by the evidence Pam Bondi had gathered. The weight of his fall from grace hung in the air like a storm cloud. But for Pam, the battle was far from over. This was just the beginning of a much bigger fight, a fight that had only started to reveal the depth of the corruption that had been festering for years. Pam walked out of the courtroom, her head held high, but her mind was racing. Kinsey's arrest was a victory, but the true scope of the conspiracy was much larger than one judge. As she walked toward the parking lot, she knew this wasn't just about Kinsey anymore. This was about uncovering the system he had used to protect himself and the many others who had benefited from his actions. She glanced at her phone. A new message from Detective Henshaw. It read, "We're in. The connections go deeper than we thought. Prepare for the next phase." Pam's stomach turned. The implication was clear. Kinsey had been part of something much bigger, a network of powerful individuals who had manipulated the justice system for years. But there was no turning back now. Pam had seen too much, and the truth needed to be exposed. She met Henshaw at a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. As they sat across from each other, the seriousness of their situation became clear. "I don't think Kinsey was working alone," Pam said, her voice low. "I've seen too many connections, too many names that don't belong in this investigation." Henshaw nodded, his expression grim. "We've already traced some of the money trails, but they go in circles. The deeper we dig, the more it points to a larger group of people, corporate executives, politicians, businessmen. They're all involved." Pam clenched her fists. "They've been running this system for years. It's not just about one judge. It's about a network that thinks they're untouchable." Just then, Pam's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Kyle Donahue, her whistleblower. "I have something that could take this all down. Meet me now." Pam and Henshaw exchanged a glance before she stood up. They didn't have time to waste. This was it, the moment that could bring everything crashing down. Kyle was waiting for them outside a rundown building on the edge of town, his eyes darting nervously as he saw Pam approach. "You're sure you want to do this?" he asked, his voice shaking. Pam nodded. "We don't have a choice." They followed him inside. The air was thick with tension. Kyle led them to a small, cluttered office where a laptop sat open on the desk. "I've been digging deeper," Kyle said. "I found something that ties Kinsey to a much bigger operation, something that will make it impossible for them to cover up." Kyle handed over a flash drive, his hands trembling. "Everything's on here. The transactions, the people, the names that need to be exposed." Pam took the drive and looked at Henshaw, her resolve hardening. "This is it," she said. "The final piece we need to take them all down." Back at her office, Pam plugged the flash drive into her computer, her heart pounding. As the files opened, a flood of information poured onto the screen. Documents, transaction logs, and emails that tied Kinsey to multiple high-profile cases, corporate executives, and politicians. The corruption was everywhere. But there was one file in particular that stood out. A list of names, all of them connected to Kinsey's rulings over the years. Powerful individuals, each one benefiting from his decisions. And among them was the name of someone Pam had been investigating for years, a name that had remained elusive up until now. Pam felt a chill run down her spine. "This is bigger than we thought," she whispered. "This goes all the way to the top." She quickly gathered the evidence and called Henshaw. "It's time to bring this to the authorities," she said. "We have enough to expose them all." The next day, Pam and Henshaw arrived at the federal courthouse with the evidence in hand. They had spent weeks preparing, making sure every document, every piece of evidence, was airtight. But Pam knew that the real battle was just about to begin. Inside the courthouse, federal agents swarmed around them, preparing for the investigation that would take down an entire network of corrupt individuals. Pam felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was fleeting. The work wasn't over yet. Kinsey's arrest was just the first step in a long and difficult journey. As the agents began to move, Pam glanced over at Henshaw. "This isn't just about justice for Kinsey," she said. "It's about restoring trust in the system. We can't let these people win." Henshaw nodded. "We're not stopping until we get them all." Pam watched as the agents dispersed, the first wave of the takedown beginning. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of hope. The battle was far from over, but Pam Bondi was ready. Ready to expose the truth, ready to fight for justice, and ready to bring down an entire system built on lies and corruption. The tide was turning, and there was no turning back now. The weight of the case was finally settling in as Pam Bondi stood at the front of the courthouse, her eyes scanning the bustling crowds of reporters and law enforcement. For months, she had fought relentlessly against a powerful web of corruption, and today, the final pieces were falling into place. She could feel the shift in the air. The justice she had long sought was now within reach. But even with all the evidence in hand, she knew the final battle had yet to be fought. Inside the courthouse, preparations were underway for the most important trial of Pam's career. The walls that had shielded Judge Robert Kinsey and his network were about to come crashing down. Pam's hands were steady, her resolve unbreakable. She had faced threats, intimidation, and unimaginable odds to get to this point, but she wasn't about to let anything stop her now. "Do you think they'll fight back?" Henshaw asked, his voice low as he walked alongside her. His eyes were sharp, scanning their surroundings. "They will," Pam replied, her tone firm. "But we have something they can't escape. The truth." She paused, her gaze turning toward the doors of the courthouse, where agents were preparing to bring in the final pieces of the puzzle. And no matter how hard they try to hide, it's already too late. As the case unfolded in court, the once mighty Kinsey stood powerless at the defense table, his face pale and devoid of his usual confidence. The evidence Pam had collected was irrefutable. There were no more games, no more tricks. He had run out of time and options. The network of corruption, once a secret among the elite, was now laid bare for the world to see. But Pam knew the fight wasn't just about exposing Kinsey. It was about what this case represented, the battle for integrity in a broken system. For too long, the powerful had manipulated the scales of justice, hiding behind their titles and wealth. But now, that power was slipping through their fingers like sand. The final witness, Natalie Briggs, took the stand. Her testimony was raw, her voice trembling but resolute. She had once been a cog in the machine, part of the corruption, but now she was the key to its undoing. As she spoke, the courtroom hung on her every word. The truth was undeniable, and it was inescapable. Pam sat at the prosecution's table, watching as the pieces clicked into place. Kinsey's fate was sealed. But this wasn't just about winning a case. It was about something bigger. It was about restoring the faith that had been lost. It was about sending a message to everyone who had ever believed that justice was out of reach. The judge's gavel fell with a resounding crack, signaling the end of the trial. "Guilty," the judge declared. The words echoed through the courtroom, the sound reverberating in Pam's chest like a drumbeat. For a moment, everything went still. The tension, the fight, the months of sleepless nights, it was all worth it. Judge Kinsey, the man who had once held so much power, was now a prisoner of his own making, and as he was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Pam felt a surge of something deep within her. Relief, triumph, but also a deep sadness for the system that had allowed it to go this far. As the cameras flashed and the press clamored for statements, Pam walked out of the courthouse, her mind already on what came next. This victory was important, but it was just one step in a much larger fight. The battle against corruption, against the system that protected the guilty, wasn't over. But for the first time, Pam knew she had made a difference. She had exposed the truth, and the world was watching. As Pam walked down the courthouse steps, she glanced up at the sky, the Florida sun casting long shadows on the ground. It felt like the beginning of something new, a new era where justice could no longer be bought and sold. And then, as the reporters swarmed around her, Pam turned to face them, her eyes burning with resolve. "It's not just about winning cases," she said, her voice calm but powerful. "It's about making sure that what we do here today matters for tomorrow, that we leave a legacy of truth, of justice, for the ones who come after us. Because when we stand up, when we refuse to back down, we change the world." The press fell silent for a moment, and Pam's words lingered in the air. She had done what most thought was impossible. She had taken on a corrupt system, exposed the truth, and won. But she wasn't done yet. This victory was just the beginning. As the camera shutters clicked and the reporters scribbled notes, Pam Bondi walked away, her head held high, knowing that the fight for justice would continue. Because justice, real justice, always finds a way, and the world would never be the same again.